Hello everyone, this is Naerina from 40k Theories, and welcome to this new episode of 40k Lore for Newcomers. For this episode, nominated on Patreon by Brett Reader, we will be taking a brief look at the Aeldari Craftworld of Iyanden. This video will be a brief overview for certain events that may be explored in greater depth within additional videos within the future. So, without further ado, let's begin.
Gather the dead for war. Let them join our ranks, lest we are forced to join theirs.
Iyanden, also known as the Light in the Darkness, is one of several Aeldari Craftworlds, colossal world ships that are populated by the few surviving Aeldari of the Asuryani sect. The world rune of Iyanden is that of the Shrine of Asuryan, the eternally burning flame of the Phoenix King, which serves as a symbol of hope for the species as a whole. The history of Iyanden is perhaps the most tragic of the Craftworlds, as a once shining beacon of hope and prosperity for the ever-dwindling Aeldari would eventually become little more than a sparsely populated ruin, a place where the living are vastly outnumbered by the dead. As a result, Iyanden, more so than any other Craftworld, is forced to make extensive use of wraith constructs during times of war, machines that are, for want of a better term, piloted by the souls of the dead. While they teeter precariously upon the verge of extinction, the people of Iyanden nonetheless believe that they will not only one day recover from the losses that they have sustained over the millennia, but will even rise to become the preeminent Craftworld. But as to whether or not Iyanden will be able to achieve such lofty goals, only time will tell.
Though my body dies, I will remain evermore. My spirit stays on in this flesh of metal, evermore.
The origins of Craftworld Iyanden can be traced back tens of thousands of years to when the Aeldari Empire had reached its absolute zenith in terms of both power and influence throughout the galaxy. As their society began embarking upon a downward spiral into hedonism and depravity, some Aeldari chose to abandon the core worlds of their empire and take to colossal starships known as Craftworlds, distancing themselves spiritually, ideologically, and physically from the wanton degeneracy of their species. Such a decision ultimately proved fortuitous for the Iyandani, for they would remain more or less unscathed following the onset of the Fall, a cataclysmic event that resulted in the total destruction of the Aeldari Dominion, thanks to both the birth of Slaanesh, a chaos god born in the very image of the Aeldari themselves, and the creation of a colossal warp space rift known as the Eye of Terror. While Iyanden was not the first Craftworld to leave the Aeldari Dominion behind, with that particular honor reportedly going to Saimhan, the Iyandani were amongst the first of their kind to not only make use of spirit stones, gemstones that will capture an Aeldari's soul upon death in order to prevent it from dissipating into the warp and being subsequently consumed by Slaanesh, but also the very first to construct an infinity circuit, a ship-wide network where the souls of the dead can be safely extracted from their spirit stones and laid to rest in the state of peaceful limbo. As one of the last surviving bastions of the Aeldari, and having learned from the mistakes of their predecessors, the people of Iyanden believe it was their duty to rebuild their empire and restore their species to glory. However, despite the seemingly noble intentions of the Iyandani, the other Craftworlds, save for that of Craftworld Bieltan, refused to aid Iyanden in its quest, instead choosing to follow their own paths and carry out their own missions for a variety of reasons. This resulted in the Iyandani developing a close bond of friendship with the people of Bieltan, united in a common goal of not only restoring the Aeldari as a galactic superpower, but also in combating against the forces of chaos, a threat that would only grow to be more prevalent and persistent following the events of the Fall. Over time, however, tensions began to mount between the two Craftworlds, as the more militant forces of Bieltan didn't simply wish to defeat those in service to the ruinous powers, but actively sought the subjugation or even outright destruction of any and all races that were deemed to be obstacles in restoring the Aeldari Dominion to its former glory. As a result, the two Craftworlds began to steadily distance themselves from one another, resulting in their alliance and bonds of brotherhood being quietly dissolved. In spite of this, Iyanden would continue to wage their war against the forces of chaos. In fact, it was during one such campaign against the armies of a Chaos Lord named Xemon that Iyanden would first make use of wraith constructs upon the field of battle, granting the dead a chance to avenge themselves against their hated foes. While Iyanden claimed victory after victory against the servants of the ruinous powers, it became evident that the Aeldari had grossly underestimated just how susceptible some of the galaxy's younger races, such as humanity, were to the temptations offered by chaos as a whole. In time, however, Iyanden would be forced to turn their attention away from the servants of the ruinous powers in order to combat against an entirely new and arguably even greater threat, one that would come to be known colloquially as the Great Devourer.
The time for using the knife to remove this cancer is long gone. Bring forth the torch.
In late M41, the extragalactic Xenos race known as the Tyranids would begin making their way en masse into the Milky Way galaxy, with their numerous hive fleets consuming all that lay within their path. One such hive fleet, designated Naga, besieged the Aeldari cluster, a region of space that was home to numerous maiden worlds, planets that had been previously seeded and given life by the Aeldari during ages past. Many of these worlds also held populations of Aeldari from the Exodite sects, individuals who chose to settle upon primitive, backwater worlds in order to live a simpler yet harder way of life. Seeking to defend their kin from Naga's onslaught, Iyanden, along with fellow Craftworlds Malantai and Yriel, launched an assault against one of Naga's two main tendrils. During the course of this war, the commander of the Iyandeni fleet, Admiral Drek, was slain and his flagship destroyed during the Battle of Halathel, forcing his protege, a young autarch named Yriel, to take command. While Iyanden and its allies would ultimately prove victorious during their war against Hive Fleet Naga, a number of Exodite worlds were overrun by the Tyranids, forcing Yriel to order his forces to scour them of all life with concentrated orbital bombardments. The war against Hive Fleet Naga was not without further cost. Craftworld Malantai was destroyed during the conflict, another grievous blow against the species already teetering upon the precipice of extinction. Despite this, Iyanden itself sustained minimal losses during the war with Hive Fleet Naga, perhaps leading the Iyandeni to believe that the greater bulk of the Tyranid threat had been quashed. While the Spirit Seers of Yriel attempted to warn their allies that Naga was but part of a much greater threat, many of Iyanden's own seers, in typical Aeldari fashion, remained arrogant in their victory. Prince Yriel went on to prove himself a highly capable commander and, with the aid of the Farseer Kelmon Firesight, convinced the rest of the Craftworld Seer Council to allow him to launch an assault against the forces of the Chaos Lord Argon Calarax. Yriel's desire to crush Calarax's forces, however, would prompt him to commit the entirety of the Iyandeni fleet to the attack, leading to what would become known as the Battle of the Burning Moon. However, Yriel's actions would leave the Craftworld more or less defenseless, and while the Iyandeni fleet would ultimately prove victorious against the forces of chaos, 3 of Calarax's ships would move with all haste towards Iyanden itself, intent on claiming some measure of revenge. In desperation, Yriel's forces launched an intercept course, destroying 2 of the 3 Chaos Cruisers. But before the final vessel could be destroyed, it succeeded in striking Iyanden with a cyclonic torpedo, a weapon designed to break its way through the very bedrock and crust of a planet. The death toll ran to the tens of thousands, a truly catastrophic loss in its own right. But the Craftworld's Infinity Circuit would also be grievously damaged, casting countless souls into the depths of the warp to be consumed by demonic entities. Realizing that his hubris had cost his people dearly, Yriel, along with his closest followers, would go into a self-imposed exile to live the life of a corsair, although some maintain that such a decision was, in truth, not a voluntary one, and that the Autarch and his followers had instead been banished from Iyanden after being tried and found guilty of placing the Craftworld in unnecessary danger. While the situation for Iyanden already looked bleak, the worst was, in truth, yet to come.
We may have won the battle, but our ancestors have lost their souls.
A mere 5 decades after the Battle of the Burning Moon, Iyanden would once again come under assault, this time from the Tyranids of Highfleet Kraken. While the Iyandeni may have initially thought little of the dangers posed by Kraken, a number of Aeldari rangers would bring irrefutable proof to the Craftworld Seer Council, which showed that this particular High Fleet was far, far larger than originally believed, a much greater threat than even the swarms of High Fleet Naga. Not only this, but thanks to the sheer intensity of Kraken's shadow, the warp, a psychic white noise that affected interstellar and psychic communications across the span of several light years, in conjunction with the relatively slow speed of the Craftworld itself, making it impossible to flee from the encroaching swarm, the people of Iyanden were left with no choice but to stand and fight. Such was the threat posed by the Tyranids that not only would thousands of wraith constructs be brought online, but the Craftworld's avatar of Cain, a living embodiment of the Aeldari god of war itself, was roused from its slumber to aid in Iyanden's defense. The ensuing conflict was a long and bloody affair, with the Aeldari fighting with a savage desperation against the seemingly unending horde of monstrosities threatening their home. Despite the Aeldari's best efforts, however, attrition would soon begin taking its toll, and the extinction of the Iyandeni seemed to be all but a certainty. All was not lost, however, for word of the Craftworld's struggle eventually reached the exiled Prince Yriel. Upon learning of the danger threatening his former home, Yriel, along with the rest of his Corsair fleet, rushed to Iyanden's aid. Yriel's forces, along with the remnants of the Iyandeni fleet, would manage to stem the flow of Tyranid organisms landing upon the Craftworld, destroying many of their hive ships within Iyanden's orbit. But while the battles in the Void were finally turning the Aeldari's favor, the situation upon Iyanden's surface was far grimmer. The Craftworld's avatar, despite slaying scores of Tyranid organisms, would eventually be overwhelmed and torn apart by a pack of 12 carnifexes, colossal monstrosities boasting a size, power and durability equivalent to that of tanks. Prince Yriel would then lead his men in a ground assault against the Tyranids in a final last-ditch effort to aid the defenders against the swarm. Yriel himself would throw himself into the fray, charging directly at the enemy hive tyrant, a beast that was, for all intents and purposes, the commander of Kraken's ground forces in this particular instance. With a single thrust of his Spear of Twilight, a powerful and ancient weapon that would in time be revealed to be one of the legendary Crone Swords, Yriel would slay the hive tyrant, cutting the head off of the proverbial snake. With their connection to the hive mind now severed, the Tyranids upon Iyanden's surface were reduced to little more than feral animals and fell quickly to the vengeful guns and blades of the Aeldari. The forces of Kraken would finally be destroyed or driven off, and the Iyandeni would prove victorious. However, such a moment proved to be bittersweet, for while Iyanden itself still stood, over 80% of the Craftworld's population had perished during the conflict. For a species already perilously close to extinction, such a loss would prove almost next to impossible to recover from. Henceforth, whenever the people of Iyanden went to war, they would be forced to rely more and more heavily upon the use of wraith constructs, forcing the dead to fight upon the field of battle once more, so that the living may continue to endure. And that concludes this edition of 40k Lore for Newcomers. If you like this video, consider supporting us on Patreon for more content. To those that are new to 40k, we hope you learned something. So, leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.